I found the phone on a cold Tuesday afternoon in February while I was finally putting away Christmas decorations I had been avoiding for weeks. It was hidden inside an old toolbox in the garage, buried beneath a layer of rags that smelled like motor oil, dust, and years of neglect. When I unlocked it and saw the messages, saw her name, saw the photographs, I sat down on the cold concrete floor and realized that for 32 years I had been sleeping beside a man I did not know at all. The breaking did not happen that Tuesday. The breaking had been happening for years. I just had not been looking. Before I tell you what happened, tell me where you are watching from today. Whether it is early morning, the middle of a busy day, or late at night when the world has finally gone quiet, I would love to know. And tell me something. Have you ever known someone who kept saying, "I am fine," even when you knew they were not? I read every comment, and I am always grateful for the time you spend here with me. Now, let me tell you what happened. My name is Margaret, and when this story begins, I am 54 years old. I have been married to Robert for 32 years. We have 3 children. Sophie is 31 and works in marketing in the city. James is 29 and teaches high school English 2 towns over. Lily is 17 and still lives at home with us. We own a 4-bedroom house with blue shutters on a street where everyone knows everyone else's business. Or at least they think they do. I work part-time at the library. Robert works in project management for a manufacturing company. On paper, we are ordinary. On paper, we are fine. I want to tell you that I saw the signs. I want to tell you that I knew something was wrong and fought to save him before everything shattered. But that would be a lie, and I have had enough of lies. The truth is that I saw the signs and explained them away. I saw the changes and told myself they were normal. I watched my husband become a stranger in small increments, and I convinced myself that this was simply what happened after 3 decades of marriage. People change. People get tired. People have bad years at work. I told myself all of this because the alternative was too frightening to consider. Some people do not leave your life all at once. They leave in pieces. A little presence today, a little honesty tomorrow, until one day all that remains is a familiar face carrying a stranger's heart. People imagine collapse as something dramatic. A single bad decision, one terrible night, one moment that changes everything. Real collapse is quieter. It arrives in inches, so slowly that by the time you notice it, the damage is already done. I think it started about 5 years before I found the phone. Robert came home from work one evening in March, and he was quiet. Not ordinary quiet, a different kind of quiet, the kind that sits heavy in a room and makes the air feel thicker. I was making dinner, chicken and rice. Something simple because it had been a long day at the library and I was tired. He walked into the kitchen and set his briefcase down by the door. He always set it by the door. Then he would kiss me on the cheek and ask what was for dinner. That evening he set the briefcase down and walked straight to the bedroom without saying a word. I turned off the stove and followed him. He was sitting on the edge of the bed with his hands folded in his lap, staring at the carpet. "Robert," he looked up. His smile arrived a second too late. It was not his real smile. It was the smile people use when they are trying to convince someone everything is fine. "I am fine," he said. "Just a long day. Do you want to talk about it?" "Nothing to talk about. Just tired." I stood in the doorway and studied him. His shoulders curved forward. His shirt was wrinkled. There were shadows beneath his eyes that looked older than a single day. "Are you sure?" "Margaret," I said, "I am fine." There was an edge in his voice. Not anger. Exhaustion, the kind that comes from carrying something too heavy for too long. I nodded and returned to the kitchen. I told myself he was tired. I told myself it was work stress. I told myself it would pass. It did not pass. Over the following months, Robert became quieter. He started working later. He would call at 6 in the evening and say he had to finish a project. Then 6 became 9. 9 became 10. 10 became 11. When he came home, he ate whatever I had left in the microwave, took a shower, and went to bed. We stopped having conversations that lasted longer than 5 minutes. We stopped watching television together. We stopped making love. I noticed every one of those changes. I just did not know what to do with them. How do you ask someone why they are disappearing when they are still standing right in front of you? I tried once. It was a Saturday morning in June. Robert sat at the kitchen table drinking coffee and staring at something on his phone. I sat across from him. Waited. He never looked up. Robert. Can we talk? About what? About us, I said. He finally looked up. His eyes looked tired. Everything about him looked tired. What about us? I feel like we have not really talked in months. He rubbed both hands over his face. I am busy, Margaret. You know that. I know you are busy. But this feels like more than busy. He sighed. I am just stressed. It feels like you are pulling away. I am not pulling away, Margaret. Then, what is happening? Nothing is happening. His voice remained calm, but there was a pleading quality underneath it, like he desperately wanted me to stop asking questions. I am tired. I am stressed. I am trying to keep everything together, and sometimes I do not have much left at the end of the day. Can you understand that? Because I loved him. I nodded. Because I loved him, I stopped pushing. Because I loved him, I gave him exactly what he wanted, space. The conversation ended. He picked up his phone. I picked up my coffee. Neither of us said another word, looking back. I understand something I did not understand then. Silence does not always arrive because people have nothing to say. Sometimes silence arrives because the truth feels too dangerous to speak aloud. Months passed, the distance grew. Neither of us knew how to cross it. Or perhaps only one of us was still trying. Sophie came home for a weekend visit in September. She had always been the most perceptive of our children, the one who could walk into a room and instantly sense what nobody was saying. She hugged me at the door, then looked past me into the house. Where is Dad? Still at work. He will be home soon. She frowned, said nothing. We made dinner together. Lily was with friends. James could not make it that weekend. The entire evening felt oddly quiet. Robert came home at 9:30. He looked surprised to see Sophie. I did not know you were coming. I told you 2 weeks ago. I must have missed it. He hugged her briefly and disappeared into the bedroom. Sophie watched him leave. Then she looked at me. Is he okay? He is fine. Just stressed. He does not look fine. I wanted to tell her the truth. The problem was that I did not know the truth. All I knew was that my husband felt increasingly unfamiliar. He is just tired. Sophie studied my face, then asked a question I did not expect. When did you and Dad meet? You know that story. Tell me anyway. I laughed softly. Why? Because I need to remember that you two were happy once. That answer hurt more than I expected. I leaned against the counter. We met at a bookstore. Her expression softened, and for the first time all evening, I smiled. We met at a bookstore. I repeated I was 22 years old. It was raining, and I had ducked inside to wait for the storm to pass. I was looking through a book about architecture when your father walked up beside me and asked if I was an architect or simply someone who appreciated beautiful structures. Sophie laughed. That sounds exactly like Dad. It was a terrible line. It really was, but he delivered it with so much confidence that I laughed instead of walking away. What happened after that? He asked me to have coffee with him when the rain stopped. And you said yes. I did. We sat in a little cafe for almost 4 hours. We talked about books, about travel, about family, about the lives we hoped to build someday. Your father told me he wanted children. Not just children, a family, a home where people felt safe, a place where nobody had to pretend to be someone they were not. I paused. The memory felt strangely distant, like it belonged to someone else. He meant it, Sophie said quietly. I know. So what happened? I did not have an answer. Not then, not yet. For a few moments neither of us spoke. The pasta simmered quietly on the stove. Outside, the last light of evening was fading. Sophie waited. Not for an answer. For a memory, and somehow that felt easier. Because I could still remember the good years. The years before distance and silence became permanent guests in our home. The years when loving Robert felt as natural as breathing. So I told her. Robert and I married 8 months after we met. Everyone told us it was too fast. My mother said I barely knew him. Maybe she was right. Maybe nobody ever truly knows another person. Not completely. Not forever. At the time, though, I was certain. Robert felt steady, safe. The kind of man who made frightening things seem manageable simply because he was standing beside you. Our wedding was small. 30 people gathered in my parents' backyard. Robert wore a suit borrowed from his brother. I wore a dress I found in a consignment shop. Neither of us cared. We were too busy looking at each other. We wrote our own vows. I can still remember the way his voice shook. Margaret, he said, I promise to see you, not just look at you, but really see you. I promise to listen when you speak and hear what you are not saying. I promise to build a life with you where neither of us has to pretend to be anything other than exactly who we are. I believed every word. I smiled. Despite myself, you know, when you were born, your father cried. Sophie's eyebrows lifted. Dad cried. I laughed softly. Not quiet tears, deep, overwhelming sobs. He held you against his chest and kept whispering promises you were far too young to understand. What kind of promises? That he would protect you, that he would take care of you, that he would always be there for a moment. Sophie looked down at the counter, as though she was trying to picture it. Then another memory surfaced. When James arrived 2 years later, Robert spent endless nights walking the living room floor with him when he had colic. I would wake up at 2 in the morning and find Robert pacing slow circles through the dark house. You should sleep, I would tell him. You carried him for 9 months. The least I can do is carry him for a few hours. When Lily was born, he stood beside my hospital bed, holding our daughter's tiny hand. You have given me everything I ever wanted, he said. You do not have to thank me. This is ours. We built this together. He kissed my forehead. I will never forget that. For a long time, I believed he never would. Across the kitchen, Sophie was watching me carefully, listening to stories she had heard pieces of before. Stories that suddenly sounded different now, as though she was trying to reconcile the father she remembered with the man who now came home after dark and barely spoke. I understood the feeling. I had been trying to do the same thing for years. Moments that once seemed ordinary looked different now. Questions that once sounded casual felt heavier in hindsight. And there was one conversation I kept coming back to, one that made far more sense now than it did then. There was a night years later when Lily was 5. The children were asleep. Robert and I sat on the back porch drinking wine and watching fireflies drift through the darkness. Without warning, he reached for my hand. Do you ever worry that we are going to mess this up? Mess what up? All of it. The marriage. The kids. This life. I laughed softly. Everyone worries about that. I mean, really mess it up. His voice sounded unusually serious. Wake up one day and realize we have been doing everything wrong, and now it is too late to fix it. I squeezed his hand. We are not going to mess it up. How do you know? Because we love each other. We love them. That matters. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded. You are right. At the time, I thought the conversation was over. Now, I wonder if it was actually the beginning. Maybe that was the first crack. Maybe that was the first glimpse of the fear he never learned how to name. Maybe he was asking for help years before either of us realized it. I should have asked more questions. I should have asked what he was afraid of. Instead, I gave him reassurance. The easy kind. The comfortable kind. The kind that lets difficult conversations die before they begin. That is the thing about love when it has lasted a long time. You stop checking the foundation. You assume that because something was built strong, it will remain strong forever. You forget that even the strongest structures require maintenance, attention, care, honesty, someone willing to notice the cracks before they become fractures. Robert and I had years of beautiful moments. Vacations where we laughed until our stomachs hurt. Sunday mornings where we sat together reading the paper without needing to speak. Evenings spent planning futures that felt guaranteed. There were nights when he would wrap his arms around me afterward and say, "I am the luckiest man alive." I believed him. I believed our marriage was unbreakable. I understand now that nothing is unbreakable. Not marriages. Not families. Not people. Everything eventually breaks under enough pressure. Sometimes the pressure comes from the outside. Sometimes it comes from somewhere much closer: fear, shame, exhaustion, the quiet belief that you are failing at the one thing that matters most. Robert had always defined himself by his ability to provide, to protect, to carry the weight. That was not simply something he did. It was who he believed he was. When I met him, he was 24 years old and working his first serious job. He talked constantly about the future, about the life he intended to build, and for a long time, he succeeded. Promotions came, raises came, the house with the blue shutters came, college funds, family vacations, a life that looked successful from the outside. The problem with building your identity around being the strong one is that eventually strength becomes a prison. The moment you begin struggling, you no longer know who you are. You do not know how to ask for help. You do not know how to admit you are scared. You only know how to pretend, and pretending can become its own kind of addiction. One lie. Then another, until eventually the performance becomes easier than the truth. I did not understand any of that back then. All I knew was that my husband was disappearing, and I did not know how to bring him back. Some betrayals happen in a single moment. A choice, a kiss, a lie. But the most dangerous betrayals are slower. They happen over years. In small silences, in conversations avoided, in fears left unspoken. In all the moments when someone stops choosing honesty and nobody notices until they are already gone. The next morning, Sophie found Robert making coffee in the kitchen. She sat at the table watching him. I could tell she had been thinking about something all night. Finally, she spoke. "Dad? Yeah. Can I ask you something?" "Sure. Are you happy?" The question hung in the air. Robert stopped pouring coffee. For just a second, something passed across his face. Then, it disappeared. The familiar smile returned, the one that never reached his eyes. "Of course I am happy." "Then why do you seem sad all the time?" His shoulders tightened. "I am just getting older." "That is not what I mean." "What do you mean?" "I mean, it feels like something is wrong." He set the coffee pot down, harder than necessary. "I appreciate the concern, Sophie. But I am fine." "You do not seem fine." "I am tired." "You are always tired." The room went quiet. Finally, Robert sighed. I know, for a moment, he looked older than I had ever seen him. Then the smile returned. The mask slipped back into place, and the conversation ended. What none of us understood then was that people rarely collapse all at once. Most collapse happens quietly. A little hope today, a little energy tomorrow, a little honesty after that, until eventually the person you love is still standing in front of you, but the distance between who they are and who they pretend to be has become impossible to cross. And somewhere inside that growing distance, the future was already beginning to unravel. Sophie left on Sunday afternoon. Before she got into her car, she pulled me aside. "Mom, something is really wrong with Dad," I sighed. "He has been stressed." "No," her answer came immediately. "He is more than stressed." I folded my arms. "Sophie, Mom, listen to me." There was something in her voice that made me stop. Not panic, not accusation, fear. The kind that comes when someone you love is slipping away and you do not know how to stop it. I talked to him. "That surprised me." "You did. She nodded. A few weeks ago, I thought maybe seeing him in person would make me feel better. She shook her head. It didn't. What happened? She looked toward the house, as though she could still see him standing there. I called him. Her voice softened. I asked if he was okay. I already knew the answer. He said he was fine. Of course he did. A sad smile crossed her face. That was not the strange part. I waited. For a second, I thought he was going to tell me the truth. What do you mean? There was this pause. She frowned slightly, as though she were replaying the conversation. I asked if something was wrong. I told him he did not seem like himself, and for a moment her voice trailed away. For a moment he sounded tired, not physically tired, something deeper, the kind of exhaustion that settles into a person's soul. What happened then? The wall came back up. She shrugged. He told me everything was fine. He changed the subject. And that was it. The wind moved through the trees around us. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then Sophie looked at me. Mom, have you noticed how different he is? I looked away, because I had the late nights, the distance, the silence, the way he seemed present physically but absent emotionally, all of it. He is under a lot of pressure. The words sounded weak even to me. Sophie studied my face, then nodded slowly, not because she agreed, because she knew she was not going to change my mind. I hope I am overreacting. So do I. She swallowed. But I do not think I am. Neither of us spoke. The air between us felt heavy, uncertain, uncomfortable. Finally, she wrapped her arms around me. I love you, Mom. I love you too. Then she got into her car and drove away. I stood in the driveway long after she disappeared, watching the empty road, trying to convince myself she was wrong, trying to convince myself that what I was seeing was stress, exhaustion, work, anything but the growing feeling that something inside our family was quietly coming apart. Hope is a stubborn thing. It will keep rebuilding a bridge long after the other side has stopped crossing it. James came home for Thanksgiving. He had always been the quietest of our children. Sophie felt everything and said it. Lily felt everything and showed it. James felt everything and buried it. When he was little, he cried if Robert raised his voice even slightly. Not because Robert was harsh, he was not. James simply noticed things other people missed. The mood in a room, the tension beneath a conversation, the difference between what people said and what they meant. He learned very early how to read people. The problem was that children who learn to read people often learn to ignore themselves. That Thanksgiving, he barely spoke. He helped me cook. He set the table. He laughed when everyone else laughed, but there was a tension in him that never relaxed. Every time I looked up, I found him watching Robert, watching him the way someone watches a bridge they suspect might collapse. After dinner, I found him standing alone in the backyard. The trees were bare. The sky was gray. The air smelled like rain. James, he turned. Hey, Mom, what are you doing out here without a jacket? Just needed some air. I stepped beside him. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Then he asked a question I was not expecting. Are you okay? I frowned. What do you mean? I mean, Dad is falling apart. The words landed harder than they should have. He is stressed. No, James shook his head. He is more than stressed. I looked away. He continued. Mom, I think Dad is having an affair. My entire body went cold. What? I do not have proof. Then do not say things like that. I know. His voice remained calm. Too calm. But he did not back down. You can call it a feeling if you want. You can call it intuition. You can call it whatever makes it easier to hear. He looked at me, not angry, not emotional. Worried. I just know something is wrong. I swallowed hard. You cannot know that. Maybe not. His eyes drifted toward the house. Toward the man who had been his father his entire life. Then back to me. But look at him, Mom. The way he avoids eye contact, the way he guards his phone, the way he leaves the room to take calls, the way he looks exhausted all the time. James looked down at the grass. I have tried talking to him too. The admission surprised me. You have? He nodded, a few times. What did he say? The same thing he tells everyone. A humorless smile touched his face. That he is fine. The wind stirred the bare branches overhead. I told him he seemed unhappy. I told him he looked exhausted. I asked if something was wrong. His shoulders lifted slightly. He always found a way to change the subject. What did you think? For a moment he did not answer. Then I thought he looked tired of pretending. The words settled heavily between us. His voice softened. I hope I am wrong. I really do. But I do not think Dad can keep carrying whatever he is carrying much longer. I opened my mouth, then closed it again, because the truth was that I had noticed those things too. I had simply refused to put them together. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The wind moved through the bare branches above us. Somewhere inside the house, I heard Lily laughing at something on television. The sound felt strangely distant. Part of me knew he might be right. The signs were there, the distance, the secrecy. The exhaustion, the growing feeling that something inside my marriage had shifted in a way I could no longer explain. And yet, I could not bring myself to believe it. Not fully. Not then, because after 32 years together, disbelief felt safer than truth. Every warning sign found an explanation. Every strange behavior found an excuse. Every doubt was pushed aside and replaced with another chance. Another benefit of the doubt. Another promise that things would get better. Hope is a stubborn thing. It will keep rebuilding a bridge long after the other side has stopped crossing it. James looked toward the house, toward the kitchen window glowing against the darkening sky. Then he nodded once, as though there was nothing more to say. He turned and walked back toward the house. I remained standing beneath the gray November sky, watching the last of the daylight fade and wondering if I had been ignoring something far bigger than I was ready to admit. Sometimes the people who love us see the truth before we do. Not because they have evidence, because they have distance. Distance reveals cracks that proximity learns to ignore. I had spent years standing so close to Robert that I could no longer see him clearly. James stood farther away, and from where he stood, the collapse was obvious. I did not confront Robert after Thanksgiving. I told myself I needed proof. I told myself I did not want to accuse him unfairly, but the truth was simpler. I was afraid. Afraid of what I would find. Afraid of what it would mean if James was right. So I waited. And while I waited, things got worse. Lily started having panic attacks in December. They came without warning. Usually at night, she would wake up unable to breathe. Certain she was dying, I would sit beside her bed and hold her hand until her breathing slowed. Eventually, I took her to a doctor. The doctor asked whether there was stress at home. I said no, even as I said it. I knew I was lying. The doctor suggested therapy. When I mentioned it to Robert, he dismissed the idea immediately. Therapy is for people who cannot handle their own problems, I wanted to argue. Instead, I nodded. Then I took Lily to therapy anyway. The therapist asked Lily what frightened her. Lily thought about it for a long time. Then she said something that still haunts me. I feel like something bad is about to happen. What kind of bad thing? I do not know. She looked down at her hands. It just feels like my family is breaking. The therapist looked at me. I looked away. Christmas arrived. We decorated the tree, wrapped presents, cooked dinner, took family photographs. From the outside, everything looked normal. But there was no joy inside any of it. Robert moved through the holiday like a ghost. He smiled when photographs were taken. He opened presents. He sat at the dinner table. But there was a distance in him that never seemed to close. Physically, he was with us. Emotionally, he felt miles away. Sophie watched him constantly. James barely spoke. Lily tried desperately to act cheerful, and every forced smile broke my heart. Late that Christmas night, after the house had finally grown quiet, Robert and I sat together in the living room. The tree lights glowed softly in the darkness. Outside, snow drifted past the windows. I stared at him. He stared at the tree. Finally, I asked the question that had been living inside me for months. Do you still love me? For a second, Something flickered across his face. Pain, regret, fear. Then it vanished. Of course I love you. Then why do I feel like I am losing you? He looked away. You are not losing me. Yes, I am, my voice cracked. You have not been here in months. His jaw tightened. I am tired. The words hit me harder than they should have because I had heard them for months. Every difficult conversation ended the same way. Every question, every concern, every attempt to reach him. I am tired. I shook my head. That is not an answer anymore. I am going to bed. Robert, please. His voice was barely above a whisper. I cannot do this tonight. Then he stood and walked away. I sat alone beside the Christmas tree and cried as quietly as possible so the children would not hear. Silence is dangerous. Not because it says nothing, because it creates space for damage to grow unnoticed. Looking back, that Christmas was the last chance we had to tell the truth before everything finally broke apart. January came. Then February, the distance between us became a living thing. Robert started sleeping in the den more often. He claimed he was working. Maybe sometimes he was. Maybe sometimes he was not. I stopped asking. That was my mistake. I thought avoiding conflict was preserving peace. What I was actually preserving was secrecy. 2 weeks later, I was finally putting away Christmas decorations I had shoved into the garage months earlier. I moved boxes, lifted old storage bins, and found an old toolbox beneath a stack of blankets. I do not know why I opened it. Maybe instinct knew before I did. At the bottom was a phone wrapped inside an old rag. I expected a password. There was none. Maybe he had stopped caring. Maybe he wanted to be caught. Maybe he was simply too exhausted to keep building walls. Whatever the reason, the phone opened. I opened the messages and found Diane. Hundreds of messages. Thousands of words. Entire pieces of my husband's. Life I had never seen. I love you. I miss you. I cannot wait to see you. When are you going to tell her? When are we going to stop hiding? I sat down on the garage floor and read everything. The beginning, the middle, the escalation, the lies, the promises, the affair. I watched my marriage unravel, one message at a time. It took nearly 2 hours. When I finally reached the last message, I lowered the phone into my lap and stared at nothing. Betrayal does not begin with a kiss. It begins with a secret, a private conversation, a truth handed to someone else, a burden shared with a stranger instead of a spouse. By the time another woman enters the story, the betrayal has already happened. Everything after that is just evidence. I carried the phone into the house. Robert was in the den, working on his laptop or pretending to. I placed the phone on the desk. He looked at it. Then at me. The color drained. From his face, Margaret, do not. I raised one finger. The words died before they reached his lips. Tell me the truth. He stared at the phone. For several seconds, he said nothing. Finally, he whispered. It is all true. The words landed harder than I expected. Not because I needed confirmation, because hearing it out loud made it real. My voice sounded distant, almost unfamiliar. How long? His eyes closed. 6 months. The air seemed to leave the room. 6 months. I repeated the words slowly. 6 months. 180 days. Thousands of lies. Thousands of choices. 6 whole months. My voice sounded unfamiliar. It was not like that. I stared at him. Then, what was it like, Robert? For the first time in years, he had nowhere left to hide. He looked down at the desk, then stood and walked toward the window. His back remained turned to me. I did not plan it. The words sounded weak even to him. I did not go looking for an affair. That is not an answer. His shoulders rose and fell with a slow breath. I know. I met her at a conference in October. There it was, the beginning. Not the lie. The truth, or at least part of it. She worked with one of our partner companies. We talked during a break. Then we talked again, and eventually we started having coffee together. He stopped. The silence stretched. "And then?" I asked. His head lowered, and then I started telling her things. I laughed. Not because anything was funny, because sometimes pain comes out sounding like laughter. You started telling her things. It was not a question, yes. What kinds of things? The things I should have been telling you. Something twisted inside my chest. What things, Robert? My fears, my stress, my exhaustion, the money problems, the job, the pressure. He finally turned around. His eyes were red. Not from crying. From carrying something too long. I was drowning, Margaret. I folded my arms. Drowning in what? Everything. He sank into a chair. For the first time since I had entered the room, he looked defeated. Not guilty. Defeated? The pressure, the fear, the feeling that I was failing everyone. Every word felt raw, like something dragged into daylight after years in the dark. You never told me. No, you let me believe everything was fine. Yes, you let me plan for Lilith's college. You let me believe our future was secure. His voice cracked. I did. Silence settled between us. Heavy, uncomfortable, necessary. I thought I could fix it. His eyes dropped to the floor. Every month I told myself I just needed a little more time, a better contract, a better quarter, a better opportunity. I thought I could solve it before anyone noticed. And when you could not, he laughed bitterly. Then I lied some more. I looked at him. Really looked at him. For years I had been watching him pull away, the late nights, the silence, the exhaustion, the growing distance between us. I had seen all of it. I just never imagined it would lead here. Never imagined another woman standing in the middle of our marriage. I kept asking what was wrong. My voice trembled. I kept giving you chances to tell me. Robert looked away. I know, no, I shook my head. You do not. Tears blurred my vision because if you understood, you would know. This is not just about her. His eyes lifted to mine. This is about every time you looked me in the eye and lied. Every message. Every excuse. Every late night. Every moment I defended you when people asked if something was wrong. All of it came rushing back at once. I do not even know what is real anymore. The words slipped out before I could stop them, and judging by the look on Robert's face, they hurt more than anything else I had said. His eyes closed, as though the weight of those words had landed somewhere he could not defend against. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us, heavy, uncomfortable, filled with everything that had been broken. When he finally looked up, there was no anger in his face, no excuses, no attempt to explain himself. Only regret. You are right. His voice was quiet. I lied to you. I chose every message. I chose every meeting. I chose every excuse. I chose every lie. He swallowed hard. You should hate me. Part of me wanted to. Part of me already did. But hatred was not the emotion sitting in my chest. Not anymore. What I felt was grief. Grief for the marriage I thought I had. Grief for the man he used to be. Grief for the years we had spent standing beside each other while somehow becoming strangers. Do you love her? The question hung between us. Robert closed his eyes. A long silence followed. Then, I do not know. I nodded, because the hesitation itself was an answer. I love you, his voice broke. I know that sounds impossible, but I do. I have always loved you. Then why did you stop choosing me? He looked away. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then, the truth arrived. Quietly, like most devastating things do, because I stopped believing I was enough. The room went silent. I had expected excuses. I had expected blame. I had expected manipulation. Instead, I got honesty. Late, painfully late. But honesty all the same. When I looked at you, all I saw was everything I was failing to give you. When I looked at the kids, I saw college tuition, mortgage payments, bills, responsibilities. I felt like I was letting everyone down. So instead of telling us, You disappeared. His eyes filled. Yes. I closed mine, because that answer hurt more than the affair. That was the part that hurt most, not the hotel, not the messages, not even the words "I love you." The deepest wound was realizing that my husband had been suffering beside me and decided a stranger was safer than his wife. He trusted someone he barely knew with burdens he never allowed me to carry. I would have helped you. The words came out barely above a whisper. If you had told me. His eyes dropped, because there was nothing he could say. We both knew it was true. Tears blurred my vision. You never gave me the chance. You decided for me. You decided I could not handle your truth. You decided I would think less of you. You decided I would leave. His face crumpled, and suddenly he looked older than I had ever seen him. I was terrified. I did not know how to be weak. Then you should have learned, he nodded. Because there was no defense left. Only consequences. Only truth. Only damage. We stood there for a long time. Neither of us moving. Neither of us pretending anymore. Finally, I picked up the phone. The same phone that had destroyed 32 years of certainty. And I looked at him one last time. What happens now? I asked. Robert stared at the floor. For several seconds, he said nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I do not know. For once, neither did I. The silence stretched between us. Then he lifted his eyes to mine. Do you want me to leave? I stared at him. The man who had held my hand through childbirth. The man who had sat beside me at funerals. The man who had built a life with me, and then hidden another life inside it. Yes. The word felt like breaking glass. His eyes closed. For a moment, I thought he might argue. Instead, he simply nodded. 10 minutes later, I heard his car leave the driveway. I stood alone in the den and felt 32 years collapse around me. You do not know what you are made of until something breaks you. And even then, you are not really sure whether you are rebuilding yourself or simply rearranging the pieces into a shape that can survive. The next day I called the children, all of them. I asked them to come home. Sophie arrived first. Then James Lily came downstairs after hearing their voices. The four of us sat together in the living room. No one spoke. Everyone already knew something was wrong. Your father and I are separating. Sophie's eyes closed, as though the confirmation hurt even more than the suspicion. For months, she had feared something was wrong. Now she finally knew what it was. James lowered his head, not surprised, just devastated, as though hearing the truth out loud somehow made it more real. Lily looked from face to face, confused, afraid, waiting for someone to explain what was happening. What happened? Her voice shook. I looked at my children and hated what I was about to do to them. Your father has been having an affair. The room fell silent. Not ordinary silence. The kind that changes people. Oh my God, Sophie's voice broke. James pressed a hand against his mouth. Lily stared at me, as though waiting for me to take the words back, to tell her she had misunderstood, to tell her it was not true. It is true. I watched the realization spread across her face, and hated that I could not protect her from it. The hardest part of betrayal is not the moment you discover it. It is all the moments afterward. The mornings when you wake up and remember it is real. The empty chair at the table. The silence where a familiar voice used to be. The sudden realization that every plan you made was built on information that no longer exists. For the first few days, I moved through life on autopilot. I went to work. I answered questions. I made dinner. I folded laundry. I smiled when people spoke to me. And all the while, it felt as though my life had continued moving forward without my permission. Robert called several times. I ignored every call on the 5th day. I answered. What do you want? His voice sounded exhausted. I need to talk to you. You had months to talk to me. The line went quiet for a moment. I thought he might argue, defend himself, offer another explanation. Instead, when he finally spoke, his voice sounded worn down to nothing. You are right. Silence settled between us. Then, please, Margaret, just my name, nothing else. No excuses, No defense. Just a man standing in the ruins of his own choices asking for one last chance to be heard. I closed my eyes. Part of me wanted to hang up. Part of me wanted to scream. Part of me never wanted to hear his voice again. But another part wanted answers. Needed them. And in the end, that part won. 1 hour. The breath he released sounded almost painful. Thank you. Maple Street Diner. Another pause. Tomorrow. 2 o'clock. I will be there. The line went dead before he could say anything more, and for the next 24 hours, I hated myself for looking forward to hearing what he had to say, because anger had answered some of my questions, but not all of them. The next afternoon, he was already waiting when I arrived. He looked terrible. His clothes hung loosely on him. Dark circles sat beneath his eyes. He looked like someone who had not slept in weeks. Maybe he had not. I slid into the booth. A waitress brought coffee. Then left us alone. Neither of us touched our cups. Talk. Robert stared out the window, then finally spoke. The first salary cut happened almost 2 years ago. I frowned. What salary cut? Robert looked down at his hands. For several seconds, he said nothing. The diner hummed around us. Silverware clinked against plates. People laughed at nearby tables. Ordinary life continued while ours sat in pieces between us. The company has been struggling for a long time, he said. It was supposed to be temporary. I stared at him. You never told me. No, I did not. Why? He laughed softly. Not because anything was funny, because sometimes shame sounds like laughter, because I thought I could fix it before it mattered. I folded my arms. It mattered, Robert. His eyes stayed fixed on the table. No matter how much it was, it mattered. The silence stretched between us. Then he continued. The first month I told myself it would be reversed. The second month I told myself new contracts were coming. The third month I started moving money around. What money? The savings account. I felt my stomach tighten. The college fund. His face crumpled. Some of it. For a moment I could not speak. The betrayal somehow felt different from the affair. Not bigger. Not smaller. Just different. You touched Lily's college fund. I replaced some of it. Some? Not all. I closed my eyes, because every answer seemed to reveal another secret. Another hidden room inside a house I thought I knew. I kept thinking I was 1 good month away from fixing everything. His voice trembled. Then 1 month became 6, 6 became 12. And suddenly, I was spending all my energy trying to hide how bad things had become. Eventually, he looked up. For a moment, he seemed to be deciding how much truth he could survive telling. Then he said it. My salary was cut nearly 40%. The number hit me like a punch. Nearly half of the income our family depended on. Nearly half of the future we thought we had. There is more, he said quietly. Of course there was. There always was. When did you realize the company was not recovering? Robert rubbed his forehead. About 8 months ago. The answer surprised me. That long. He nodded. That was when I realized the contracts were not coming back. The cuts were continuing, and for the first time, I could not see a way out. And the mortgage. His eyes closed briefly. We started falling behind about 5 months ago. 5 months. 5 months of notices. 5 months of fear. 5 months of secrets. The bank started foreclosure proceedings last month. The words settled between us. Heavy. Permanent, impossible to take back. For a moment neither of us spoke. The numbers alone felt impossible to absorb. But the financial damage was only part of what sat between us. You should have trusted me. His eyes dropped. I was afraid. We could have faced it together. His jaw tightened. I see that now. We might have saved the house. The pain on his face answered before he did. Maybe we could have. Maybe we could not have. Neither of us would ever know. The coffee sat untouched between us, growing colder with every passing minute. The silence stretched between us. Outside, cars passed. People moved through ordinary afternoons. completely unaware that an entire life was coming apart inside a booth at the Maple Street Diner. After a long moment, Robert spoke again. "I never stopped loving you." I laughed bitterly. That statement has lost a lot of value recently. He nodded slowly. "I suppose it has." Then he looked out the window, watching strangers move through lives that had nothing to do with ours. Diane met me after the damage was already done. I said nothing. She never knew the version of me who could handle everything. She never knew the version of me who paid every bill. She never knew the version of me who always had answers. He rubbed his eyes. She met the broken version, the scared version, the version that woke up every morning convinced he was failing. His voice cracked, and she did not seem disappointed. I looked at him and suddenly understood something terrible. Diane had not stolen his affection. She had inherited his vulnerability, the part he should have been sharing with me, the part he was too frightened to bring home. I studied him. The man sitting across from me was not arrogant, not defensive, not manipulative. He looked broken, completely broken, and somehow that made everything worse. Because villains are easier to leave than wounded people. "I do not know if I can forgive you." His eyes dropped. "I understand. I do not know if I even want to." The words seemed to hit him physically. He swallowed hard. "I understand that too, but I need you to hear something." He nodded once. "You did not just betray me with the affair. You betrayed me by deciding I could not handle the truth." His eyes closed. "You decided for me. You decided I was too fragile. You decided I was not strong enough to stand beside you." Tears slipped down his face, and that hurts more than Diane. He covered his eyes. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then I stood. "I need time." He lowered his hands and nodded. "I understand. Do not call me." His jaw tightened. "Okay, do not come to the house." Another nod. "I will not. When I am ready to talk, I will let you know." His eyes remained fixed on the table. "I will wait." I looked at him for a moment, then turned and walked away. I left him sitting there, alone. And for the first time in 32 years, I drove away from my husband without knowing if I would ever come back. Sometimes the hardest person to forgive is not the person who hurt you. Sometimes it is yourself. Not for what you did, for what you failed to see. A week later, I visited my mother. Rose was 78 years old and possessed the rare ability to make truth sound unavoidable. She listened while I told her everything. The affair, the lies, the mortgage, the financial collapse, the shame, the silence. She never interrupted, never rushed me, never offered advice before I was finished. When I finally stopped talking, she poured tea into 2 chipped ceramic cups and sat across from me. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then she asked a question I had been avoiding. "Was he always this afraid?" I blinked. "What?" "Your husband." She stirred her tea slowly. "Was he always this afraid?" I opened my mouth to answer, then stopped, because the answer arrived faster than I wanted it to. Yes. Robert had always worried, always carried responsibility, always believed it was his job to hold everything together, even when nobody had asked him to, even when the burden was crushing him. I thought about all the years I had watched him pace the house after everyone went to bed. The way he checked bank accounts, the way he worried about college tuition before the children were even old enough to drive, the way he carried every setback as though it were a personal failure. I had spent years admiring that part of him, respecting it, trusting it. I had simply mistaken fear for strength. My mother nodded slowly. That is the trouble with people like Robert. I frowned. What do you mean? They spend so much time protecting everyone from their fears that eventually nobody knows they are afraid. She lifted her cup. Not even themselves. The words settled heavily between us, because I could see the truth in them. Robert had spent decades convincing everyone he was strong. Maybe he had convinced himself too. My mother took a sip of tea, then looked directly at me. Fear wears a lot of disguises. I looked down at my hands, and silence is one of them. The room grew quiet. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street. Somewhere in the house, an old clock ticked. That sentence stayed with me, because deep down I knew she was right. For years I had viewed Robert's silence as stubbornness, as pride, as emotional distance. Now I wondered how much of it had been fear of failure, fear of disappointing us, fear of admitting he could not carry everything alone. And for the first time since finding the phone, I began to wonder whether the affair had been the end of the story, or simply the symptom of something that had been breaking inside Robert for years. A week later, the phone rang. Mrs. Patterson, the neighbor from 2 houses down. Her voice was trembling. Margaret. Immediately, my stomach dropped. What happened? There are ambulances at Robert's apartment. Everything inside me froze. I think you should come. I do not remember grabbing my keys. I do not remember the drive. I only remember seeing flashing lights. Paramedics, police cars, a stretcher, and Robert, a paramedic, stopped me before I reached him. Are you Margaret? Yes. He asked us to call you. My chest tightened. What happened? He took a bottle of sleeping pills. The world tilted. We got here in time. The words barely registered. Alive. He was alive. That was all I cared about. In that moment, none of the anger mattered. None of the unanswered questions. None of the betrayal. The only thing that mattered was that he was still alive. They let me ride in the ambulance. Robert opened his eyes once. Just once. When he saw me, tears slid down his face. I am sorry. The words were almost inaudible. I took his hand and held on. At the hospital, they admitted him immediately. The next morning, I sat beside his bed. He looked smaller somehow. Not physically. Emotionally, like every defense he had ever built had finally collapsed. Why? The question came out before I could stop it. He stared at the blanket. For a long time. Then, because I could not see a way forward, I said nothing. He continued. I thought everyone would be better off without me. No, it felt true. His voice broke. I know it does not make sense. He stared at the blanket. But when you live with those thoughts long enough, they start sounding like facts. Tears filled my eyes. How long have you been carrying this alone? He laughed bitterly. I do not know. A few years. Maybe 5. Maybe longer. The room fell silent. Then the truth finally began to surface. Not all at once. Not neatly. Just fragments. Pieces of a struggle I had never fully seen. I wake up every morning exhausted. He stared at the floor. I go to bed exhausted. I spend all day pretending. Pretending I am okay. Pretending I am strong. Pretending I know what I am doing. His voice cracked. And I am tired. Not ordinary tired. Soul tired. The kind of exhaustion sleep cannot touch. I moved closer, and for the first time since finding the phone, the affair stopped being the first thing I saw. I still saw the lies. I still saw the betrayal, but I saw something else too. A man who had spent years carrying something he never talked about. Something I still did not fully understand. That did not excuse the affair. It did not erase the lies, but it explained why the man sitting in front of me looked nothing like the husband I had known. And for the first time, I realized there were parts of his struggle I had never seen at all. Why did you choose her? He cried before answering, because he already knew there was no answer that would not hurt. She did not know who I was supposed to be. His voice trembled. With her, I could just be broken. I looked away, because I finally understood, and understanding can hurt almost as much as betrayal. I sat beside Robert's hospital bed for a long time after that. Neither of us spoke. Some truths arrive with noise. Others arrive quietly. This one settled between us like dust after a collapse. Not dramatic, not explosive, just unavoidable. Later that afternoon, one of the physicians caring for Robert stopped by his room. His name was Dr. Harris. He reviewed Robert's chart, asked several questions, and spent a long time talking with him privately. When he finished, he turned to me. I would like one of our psychiatric specialists to evaluate him. The words made my stomach tighten. Not because I disagreed, because hearing them out loud made everything feel more serious, more real. I nodded. A few hours later, I was sitting in a small consultation room on the psychiatric floor. The psychiatrist introduced herself as Dr. Reynolds. She looked to be in her early 60s. Calm, direct. The kind of person who had spent years walking people through disasters. After reviewing Robert's history, speaking with him at length, and reading the hospital notes, she folded her hands and looked at me. "Robert is suffering from severe major depression," she said. I stared at her. The diagnosis sounded both shocking and obvious, like finally seeing the answer to a puzzle that had been sitting in front of me the entire time. "How long?" She folded her hands. "It is difficult to know exactly, but based on what he has shared, several years." "Several years," I repeated. The words sound strange, even to me. Several years of exhaustion. Several years of fear. Several years of pretending. Several years of suffering in silence, while all of us mistook survival for stability. For months, I had believed another woman had stolen my husband. That was the story I told myself. The story that made the most sense. But sitting there, listening to Dr. Reynolds describe years of depression, I realized the truth was more complicated than that. Depression reached him first. Shame reached him second. Diane arrived third. Affairs often look like the disaster. Sometimes they are only the smoke. The fire had already been burning long before anyone noticed the heat. That realization did not lessen my anger. It did not erase the betrayal, but it changed the shape of it. Because suddenly I was no longer looking at a man who had simply made terrible choices. I was looking at a man who had been quietly disappearing for years, and nobody had stopped him. Not even me, especially not me. Why did he not ask for help? Dr. Reynolds gave a sad smile. Many people with depression do not realize how sick they are, and many men are taught that asking for help means failure. I thought about Robert, the man who believed strength meant carrying everything alone, the man who would rather collapse than admit he was struggling, and suddenly I understood something painful. The very qualities that had made him dependable had also made him vulnerable. The same pride that helped him provide for his family had prevented him from saving himself. "Can he get better?" Dr. Reynolds nodded. "Yes, but it will take work. Therapy, medication, honesty, support, and accountability." That last word caught my attention. Accountability. She nodded. Depression explains behavior. It does not excuse behavior. Recovery requires both compassion and responsibility. I appreciated that because I was tired of hearing people explain away bad choices. What Robert had done mattered. The affair mattered. The lies mattered. The pain he caused mattered. His illness explained those things. It did not erase them. When I returned to his room, he was staring out the window. For the first time in years, he looked strangely peaceful. Not happy, not healed, just no longer hiding. "Dr. Reynolds talked to me." He nodded. "She talked to me too." We sat quietly. Then I asked the question that had been living inside me. "Did you ever think about telling me?" His eyes filled immediately. Every day, I looked at him. "What stopped you?" His laugh was hollow. "Fear." "Fear of what?" "Everything." He rubbed his eyes. "I was afraid you would look at me differently. I was afraid the kids would lose respect for me. I was afraid you would realize I was not the man you thought I was." I swallowed hard, Robert. Nobody expects perfection. I did. The answer came instantly, without hesitation, as if he had rehearsed it 1,000 times. I expected perfection. The room fell silent, because there it was, the real enemy. Not Diane, not money, not even depression, perfection, the impossible standard he had chained himself to for decades. I thought if I worked harder, I could fix everything. He laughed bitterly, and when I could not fix it, I stopped talking about it. When that did not work, I lied. When that did not work, I withdrew. When that did not work, I found an escape, and when that stopped working, his voice broke. I knew how the sentence ended. Neither of us needed to say it. A few days later, Robert was transferred to the psychiatric unit. The first time I walked through those locked doors, I felt terrified. Not because of the patients, because of what it represented. Final proof that something had been deeply wrong for a very long time. The staff encouraged family visits. So I came every day. Sometimes we talked, sometimes we sat quietly. Sometimes we cried, and slowly something began to happen. For the first time in years, Robert started telling the truth. Not pieces of it. All of it. The ugly parts, the embarrassing parts, the parts he had spent decades hiding. He told me about his father, a man who believed men did not cry, men did not complain, men did not ask for help. They worked, provided, endured. Anything else was weakness. I spent my entire life trying to earn approval from someone who died 20 years ago. The realization seemed to shock him, as though he had never said it aloud before. I kept trying to prove I was enough. His eyes drifted toward the window, and no matter what I accomplished, it never felt like enough. I listened, because after 32 years of marriage, I realized there were entire parts of my husband I had never met. Not because he had hidden them maliciously, because he had hidden them from himself. One afternoon, he looked at me and asked a question. "Do you think I am a bad person?" The question broke my heart, because it sounded like something a frightened child would ask. I thought about the affair, the lies, the secrecy, the pain. Then I thought about the years of depression, the fear, the shame, the self-hatred. And I answered honestly. No tears filled his eyes. "I think you are a hurting person. You made terrible choices. You hurt a lot of people. But no, I do not think you are a bad person." He cried harder than I had ever seen him cry. Not when we got married, not when the children were born, not when his father died. Nothing compared to that moment, because sometimes forgiveness begins long before reconciliation. Sometimes forgiveness begins the moment someone finally believes they are still worth saving. 3 weeks later, Robert was discharged. The doctors adjusted his medication, set up therapy appointments, created a safety plan, connected him with support groups. For the first time in years, there was a roadmap, not a guarantee, but a direction. The children came home the day before his discharge, all 3 of them. We sat together in the living room. Nobody wanted to be the first to speak. Finally, Sophie broke the silence. "When does Dad come home?" "Tomorrow," she nodded. Then looked at me. "Are you taking him back?" I hesitated, because I genuinely did not know. I do not have that answer yet. Sophie stared at the floor. "I am angry. I know. I am angry about the affair. I am angry about the lies. I am angry that he tried to leave us." Tears filled her eyes. "I am angry that he made Mom carry all of this." Nobody argued, because everything she said was true. James spoke next. I knew something was wrong. His voice was barely above a whisper. I knew for months. He looked miserable. I should have said something. No, the word came out stronger than I intended. James looked up. "None of this is your responsibility." But, no, I leaned forward. "You were his son, not his therapist, not his parent, not his rescuer." His eyes filled with tears, because I think part of him had been carrying that guilt for years, even before the affair, even before the hospital. Finally, Lily spoke, the youngest, the most fragile, the one whose heart had shattered the hardest. "Is he going to do it again?" Nobody answered immediately, because nobody could. The truth was complicated. Recovery came with hope, not certainty. Then I remembered something Dr. Reynolds had said: people heal best when truth is spoken plainly. So I answered honestly, "I do not know." Lily's eyes widened. "But I do know this. He is getting help. He is taking medication. He is in therapy. He has people watching out for him, and he is not carrying everything alone anymore." Lily nodded slowly. Not reassured, but listening. Sometimes hope does not arrive as confidence. Sometimes it arrives as willingness. Willingness to try again. Willingness to believe healing might be possible. Willingness to stay in the room when leaving would be easier. The next day, Robert came home. Not as the man who left. Not as the man who betrayed us. Not even as the man who tried to die. He came home as someone finally learning how to live honestly. And all of us were about to discover whether honesty could rebuild what silence had destroyed. The first few weeks after Robert came home were awkward. Not hostile. Not angry. Just unfamiliar. We had spent 32 years learning how to live together. Now we were learning how to live together honestly. And it turned out those were very different things. Robert moved into the guest room. Neither of us suggested otherwise. The marriage still existed. Technically, but trust did not. Trust had been shattered, and broken things do not become whole simply because people want them to. They become whole because people do the work. Day after day, choice after choice, truth after truth. 3 months after he came home, Robert lost a contract opportunity he had been counting on. The old Robert would have hidden it, buried it, pretended everything was fine. Instead, he walked into the kitchen and sat down beside me. I got bad news. I looked up immediately, not because of the news, because he was telling me, before I asked, before I discovered it, before it became another secret. He stared at the table for a moment, then added quietly, "And today is hard." The words hung between us, simple, honest, uncomfortable, real. I sat down beside him. What is making it hard? I woke up feeling like a failure. The honesty startled me, not because of what he said, because of how easily he said it, as though speaking the truth had finally become less frightening than hiding it. For nearly an hour we talked about finances. Fear, disappointment, reality, no lies, no hiding, no pretending. When the conversation ended, I realized something. Trust was not returning because he was perfect. Trust was returning because he was finally honest when things were not. The affair had destroyed our marriage, but honesty was building something new. Not better, not worse, just real. Sophie remained angry the longest. She visited every weekend. At first, her conversations with Robert lasted only a few minutes. She kept emotional distance between them, a protective wall, and honestly, she had earned that wall. One afternoon, about 2 months after his discharge, I walked into the backyard and found them sitting together, talking. Actually talking. No tension, no arguments, just conversation. I stayed inside because some healing needs privacy. Later that evening, Sophie sat beside me on the porch. I do not know if I forgive him. You do not have to decide that yet. She nodded, then stared into the darkness. I think I am starting to understand him. That sentence mattered more than forgiveness, because understanding creates possibility. Forgiveness sometimes follows later. That did not mean she trusted him again. It meant she had stopped seeing him as a villain, and that mattered too. James changed in quieter ways. His healing was harder to see. Sophie carried her pain outward. Lily carried hers through anxiety. James carried his inward, the way he always had. A few months after Robert came home, James invited me to lunch. Just the two of us. We sat in a small sandwich shop halfway between our towns. For the first 20 minutes, we talked about ordinary things. Work, weather, traffic, the kinds of conversations people have when they are trying to avoid the real conversation. Then, without warning, he set down his drink. I am angry, I blinked. James almost never talked about anger. At your father, he shook his head. At everyone, the answer surprised me. What do you mean? His eyes stayed on the table. I spent my whole life trying not to make things harder for people. I said nothing, he continued. When Dad was stressed, I stayed quiet. When money was tight, I stayed quiet. When everybody else was upset, I stayed quiet. His voice trembled. I thought that was what good sons did. Something inside me broke, because I suddenly realized how much of his childhood I had misunderstood. You were a child. I know, but I did not feel like one. His eyes filled. I felt responsible. For Dad. For you. For Lily. For Sophie. For everyone. The words came faster now. Years of pressure finally finding an exit. I spent my whole life trying to make myself smaller, so nobody would have to carry me. I reached across the table, took his hand. You should never have felt that way. His smile was sad, but I did. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he whispered something that still stays with me. I do not know who I am when I am not taking care of everyone else, and suddenly, I understood. The damage had never belonged to one person alone. What happened to our family had exposed wounds in all of us. Different wounds, but wounds all the same. That realization stayed with me long after lunch ended, and over the following months, I began seeing small signs of healing in places I never expected. One afternoon, James arrived unexpectedly. Robert was in the garage organizing tools. James stood there awkwardly for a moment, then finally spoke. I started therapy. Robert stared at his son for a long moment, then set down the wrench he was holding. How is it going? James laughed nervously. I cry more than I expected. To my surprise, Robert laughed too, so do I. For the first time, both of them smiled. Not because anything was funny, because honesty can be strangely comforting. I keep realizing things. James leaned against the workbench. Like what? Like how much time I spent managing everybody else's emotions. Robert's smile disappeared, because he knew exactly where that came from. I taught you that. James looked up. No, you showed me that. The distinction mattered. One was intentional. The other was inherited. Robert looked down at the concrete floor, and for the first time in his life, I think he truly understood the cost of his silence. A moment later, he looked back up, then smiled. A real smile. The kind I had not seen in years. Good, I do not really know what I am doing. Neither do I. James laughed. So that makes two of us. They spent the rest of the afternoon talking, not exactly as father and son, more like two men trying to learn skills they should have been taught decades earlier. How to ask for help, how to admit fear, how to stop carrying everything alone. Watching them felt like watching a cycle break, and some cycles deserve to be broken. Lily's healing took longer. One afternoon during family therapy, Dr. Chen asked her a question. What are you most angry about? Lily frowned. I am not angry, Dr. Chen smiled gently. Everyone says that before they answer. The room laughed softly, even Lily. Then the smile disappeared, and the truth arrived. I am angry because nobody told me. The room became quiet. I knew something was wrong. Her eyes filled. I kept asking. I kept feeling it. She looked at Robert, and everybody kept telling me I was imagining things. Robert's face crumpled. Because she was right. We had, all of us, every single one of us, we had sensed the collapse, and then spent years convincing ourselves it was not happening. I felt crazy. Lily wiped her eyes. I thought something was wrong with me. My heart broke because she was describing exactly what so many children experience. They notice the tension, the fear, the distance, but the adults keep denying it. And eventually the children stop trusting themselves. Dr. Chen nodded. That happens a lot. Lily looked confused. What does, when adults hide reality from children? Dr. Chen folded her hands. The children still feel the reality. The sentence landed on all of us because it was true. Children do not need perfect parents. They need honest ones. The panic attacks continued for months. Not as often, but often enough. Family therapy helped. Individual therapy helped. Time helped. One evening, nearly 6 months after Robert returned home, Lily sat across from him at the dinner table. Dad? Yeah? Are you okay today? The question froze everyone, because once upon a time that question would have been dangerous. Once upon a time the answer would have been automatic. I am fine. But this time, Robert thought about it. Actually thought about it. Then answered honestly. I am struggling a little today. Lily nodded. Do you want to talk about it? I think I do. And just like that, something changed, not because the problem disappeared, because honesty had become normal. That was the moment I finally believed we might survive this. Not because nobody was hurting, because nobody was hiding. There is a difference. The foreclosure process did not happen overnight. Once Robert's finances were finally out in the open, we met with attorneys, financial advisors, and the bank. For the first time, we stopped hiding from reality and started dealing with it. The numbers were brutal. Even after restructuring debts and cutting expenses, keeping the house was no longer realistic. We had a choice: wait for the bank to take it, or sell it ourselves while we still could. Just under a year after I found the phone, we made the decision to sell the house. The blue shutters, the porch, the bedrooms where we raised our children, the kitchen where birthdays had been celebrated, the backyard where summer evenings seemed endless. Losing it hurt more than I expected. For weeks, I felt like I was grieving another death. But the truth was simple. The house had become a monument to a life we could no longer afford, and holding on to monuments can prevent you from building futures. We moved into a smaller house. Nothing fancy, nothing impressive. Just enough. The day we moved in, Robert stood in the empty living room. "This feels like failure." I looked around, then shook my head. "No, what does it feel like?" "It feels honest." For the first time in a long time, he smiled. And I realized honesty was slowly changing both of us. Not just him, me too. I started therapy, something I should have done years earlier. At first I thought therapy would focus on Robert, his depression, his affair, his choices. Instead, my therapist kept bringing the conversation back to me. Why had I ignored my instincts? Why had I accepted silence? Why had I spent years protecting everyone's comfort at the expense of truth? The answers were uncomfortable. I had spent most of my life being a peacekeeper, a fixer, a smoother of rough edges. Conflict made me anxious. Confrontation made me uncomfortable. So whenever something felt wrong, I minimized it, explained it away, told myself everything would work out. The problem was that avoidance is not peace. It is postponement. Eventually, every ignored problem collects interest, and one day, the bill arrives. Mine certainly had. About 18 months after Robert came home, we started couples therapy. Not because everything was fixed, because it was not. There were still wounds, still resentment, still questions, still grief. But there was also effort, and effort matters. One evening after a therapy session, Robert and I sat in the car long after we arrived home. Neither of us moved. Finally, he spoke. "I still do not understand why you stayed." I looked out the windshield. The answer came slowly. "I did not stay because of the affair." He frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means if the affair was the whole story, I would have left." He stared at me. I continued. "I stayed because I finally saw what was underneath it. The depression, the shame, the fear, the loneliness I swallowed. And because I saw something else." "What?" "A man trying to change." The tears came immediately. For both of us. Not dramatic tears. Quiet ones. The kind that arrive when something true finally gets spoken aloud. We sat there holding hands. Neither pretending, neither hiding, just two broken people trying to build something honest. One evening, nearly 2 years after the hospital, I realized Robert had been sleeping in our bedroom again for months. Not because we had made some grand decision, not because there had been a dramatic conversation. Somewhere along the way, the guest room had simply stopped being necessary. Healing had arrived quietly, the way most important things do. Recovery is not a straight line. There were setbacks. Hard days. Arguments, moments when old habits returned, moments when trust felt impossible, moments when forgiveness felt unfair. But there were also victories, small ones, important ones. A difficult conversation that actually happened, a panic attack survived, a therapy breakthrough, a truth spoken instead of hidden. Healing rarely arrives all at once. It arrives in moments, and those moments slowly become a life. 2 years after the hospital, Robert asked a question. We were sitting on the porch, different house, different lives, same kind of evening. "Do you think we are going to make it?" I laughed softly. The question sounded familiar, like another conversation from years ago, the night of the fireflies, the night he asked whether we would mess everything up. I took his hand. I do not know. He smiled. Fair answer. Then I squeezed his hand. But I think we are finally building something worth saving. For the first time in a very long time, neither of us looked away. 3 years after I found the phone, our family gathered for Sophie's daughter's 2nd birthday. The house was crowded, children running through the hallways, laughter echoing from room to room, too much food, too much noise, exactly the way family gatherings should be. I stood in the kitchen watching everyone, Sophie laughing with Robert, James talking openly about therapy, Lily home from college, confident, strong, passionate about psychology, passionate about helping people who felt invisible. Robert walked up beside me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he looked around the room and smiled. You know what is strange? What for years, I thought my job was protecting everyone from the truth. I nodded slowly. I think we all did. I nearly destroyed everything because of it. His voice was quiet. But the truth was the thing that saved us. I looked at him. Really looked at him. The man standing beside me was not the man I married, and I was not the woman he married. Life had changed us. Pain had changed us. Truth had changed us. But perhaps that was not entirely a bad thing. Some people spend their entire lives pretending they are fine, pretending they are stronger than they really are, pretending fear does not exist, pretending they do not need anyone. We had tried that. It almost killed us. Literally, the older I get, the more I believe something I once misunderstood completely. Silence is not peace. It is delayed pain, the hard conversations, the uncomfortable questions, the moments when you refuse to accept easy answers. Those are the moments that save lives. I think about that Tuesday in November often. The phone, the toolbox, the messages, the photographs, the moment everything changed. Back then, I thought I was discovering the beginning of the story. I was wrong. I was discovering the middle. The breaking had started years earlier, in quiet fears, hidden shame, unspoken struggles, secrets that grew larger every time they remained unspoken. Sometimes a man breaks long before anyone notices, not because the breaking is invisible, because everyone becomes skilled at pretending. The person who is suffering pretends they are fine. The people who love them pretend they believe it. And together, they create a silence dangerous enough to swallow an entire family. I wish I had been braver sooner. I wish I had asked harder questions. I wish I had pushed past the easy answers. But regret is not where the story ends, because there is another truth I have learned. You cannot save someone who refuses help, but you can refuse to participate in their silence. You can refuse to accept I am fine when everything in front of you says otherwise. You can love someone and still demand honesty. You can forgive someone and still hold them accountable. Those things are not opposites. You can stay without abandoning yourself. Love is not blindness. Love is vision. Real love sees everything. The beautiful parts, the broken parts, the admirable parts, the frightening parts, and chooses truth anyway. Not because truth is comfortable, because truth is the only place healing can begin. Robert still struggles with depression. Maybe he always will. But now he talks about it. He asks for help. He reaches out. He tells the truth. And every time he does, he wins a battle that once seemed impossible. As for me, I am still learning too, still growing, still choosing honesty over comfort. Not perfectly, but intentionally, and that has made all the difference. The greatest lesson this experience taught me is simple. People do not need perfection. They need connection. They need honesty. They need someone willing to see them clearly, not the version they present to the world, the real version, the struggling version, the scared version, the human version, because broken people do not need judgment first. They need truth, they need accountability, they need help, and sometimes they simply need someone brave enough to notice. Across the room, Lily was helping Sophie's daughter blow out imaginary candles on a toy cake. James was laughing at something Robert had said. Ordinary, simple, beautiful, the kind of moment I once would have overlooked. The kind of moment I now understood was everything. That is the life we are building now. Not a perfect life. An honest one, and after everything we have survived, I have learned that honesty is worth far more than the illusion of perfection ever was. If this story stayed with you, leave a word in the comments that captures what you are feeling right now. Maybe it is healing, maybe it is forgiveness. Maybe it is honesty. Maybe it is hope. I read every comment, and I would love to hear your thoughts. And if there is someone in your life who always says, I am fine, even when you know they are not, reach out to them. Sometimes a conversation cannot solve a problem, but sometimes it can save a life. If stories about family, resilience, sacrifice, healing, and second chances resonate with you, please subscribe and join our Cora Stories family. Every week we share powerful stories about ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges. Stories that remind us we are never as alone as we think we are. Not every family survives what happened to ours. The next family almost did not survive either. In the next story, a mother faces a different kind of breaking. When her teenage son is diagnosed with a life-threatening illness, she works 3 jobs, sacrifices everything, and pushes herself beyond every limit just to keep him alive. It is a story about love, exhaustion, survival, and the lengths a parent will go for their child. Click the story on your screen now. I will see you there.